Landmark West began our deep dive into San Juan Hill in 2021, and we began sharing this different kind of preservation with all of you in 2022, thanks to funding from the Cultural Immigrant Initiative through City Council. This is what allows us to bring us all together tonight and to introduce you to Professor Lorrin Thomas. Dr. Thomas holds a BA in history from Columbia University and a PhD from the University of Pennsylvania. She teaches courses on Latin American history and the history of Americas at Rutgers University, where she served as department chair from 2015 to 2020. Her graduate seminars address race and ethnicity in the Americas and immigration and transnationalism in the US. These dovetail with her own research about rights and equality in the 20th century Americas. A published author, Professor Thomas's first book, Puerto Rican Citizen: History of Political Identity in 20th Century New York City, was recognized with several awards and examines the meaning of Puerto Rican citizenship in the US. This was followed by Rethinking the Struggle for Puerto Rican Rights and her current project, Minority, Latino Civil Rights and the Making of Multiracial America After the 1960s. We're excited to add tonight's presentation as another chapter in our continued examination of preserving the lost neighborhood of San Juan Hill. And with that, we welcome our speaker, Professor Lorrin Thomas, for Before and After West Side Story, San Juan Hill and the History of Housing Displacement in Puerto Rican New York. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sean, for that introduction. Thank you for this invitation to all of Landmark West. I'm so excited to speak to this audience about the research that I've been doing about housing in New York City related to Puerto Rican history. So I'm going to talk tonight about the first major episode of housing displacement and redevelopment that shaped Puerto Ricans' experience in New York City in a central way, in San Juan Hill, the neighborhood that I'm sure you all know was razed to make way for Lincoln Center on Manhattan's West Side in the 1950s. So here's an image that captures that displacement in process in 1960 as the demolition was taking place. In a long coda to this story of displacement and how Puerto Ricans responded, I'll reflect on the aftermath in both the South Bronx, which by about 1970 had the most concentrated Puerto Rican population in the United States, and in Loisaida, or the Lower East Side, a smaller but vibrant Puerto Rican neighborhood where residents were among the first to push to allow squatters to transition to legal status as homesteaders in the 1970s. So just a couple of points to begin. I want to answer the question, why is housing an important focus of historical analysis? Housing is fundamental for everyone. That's an obvious point. The right to housing is listed in the United Nations 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and some countries' constitutions include a right to housing. For urban migrants, including groups like Puerto Ricans in the United States, housing often becomes the primary factor on which the rest of the group's post-migration experience depends. So understanding the history of housing allows us to see a dimension of a group's experience that to an important degree shapes everything else: employment, education, economic security, social mobility. Now, I want to add a quick word about an alternate title that I considered for my talk tonight, Broken Promises. This is a theme that I will return to a number of times, and the phrase is inspired by this mural created by artist John Fechner in the South Bronx in 1980, which I'll say more about later in the talk. This image will also come back. It's an image that captures the frustration and anger of Puerto Rican New Yorkers who were told repeatedly by city bureaucrats and political leaders that their housing needs would be met, and that if or when they were displaced, they would be able to find another place to live. So that is part of the story that I'll be examining tonight. So I want to start in San Juan Hill, not San Juan, not Puerto Rico. I'll explain the name in just a moment. San Juan Hill in the 1950s, when this lively working class community, which was at this time the fastest growing Puerto Rican neighborhood in New York, during the decade of the quote unquote Great Migration from the island, when the neighborhood was slated for demolition to make way for Lincoln Center. So how did this happen, and why did this happen? To answer the question, I'll first range back in time, explaining a bit about the idea of slum clearance, that's a phrase, a quote, and the origins of the San Juan Hill neighborhood. And I'll also describe more broadly what New York was like for Puerto Ricans in the 1950s. The proximate beginning of the story of San Juan Hill's destruction in the 50s began what city leaders called slum clearance was connected to the post-World War II housing crisis, when the vacancy rate in Manhattan hovered around 1% in the 5 years after the war. And just for reference, right now, the vacancy rate in Manhattan is about 2.2%, last time I checked. So it was a pretty severe housing crisis. Slum clearance was happening in the context of intensifying racial politics, especially in cities, returning soldiers, and African-American groups in general, and soldiers in particular pushing for civil rights that they were all the more focused on after having fought for freedom in World War II. Urban leaders and political officials wanted to control growth, the growth of cities, promoting mostly middle-class interests and presenting an image of United States achievement and dominance in the world, projecting this image particularly to the Soviet Union. So the Cold War shaped this mentality about controlling visible poverty in urban life. I'll get back to the Cold War era, the 1950s, in a moment. But I want to talk first about the much older roots of the issue of slums. So slums, and again, I mostly use that term in quotes, but it was a kind of just very common description through much of the first 3/4 of the 20th century. Slums had been perceived and talked about in racialized ways since the late 19th century, particularly related to the immigrant communities in New York City, in Lower Manhattan, starting in the 1880s and 1890s. It was sort of this social problem of the slum. So San Juan Hill had been a mixed race working class community since the early 20th century. It was actually the city's most important African-American neighborhood before Harlem real estate opened up to Black Americans in the 1920s. W.B. Du Bois lived in San Juan Hill in 1909, the year he helped found the NAACP, which I'll come back to in a moment, related to another character in the story. Also, the founding editor of the Amsterdam News, first published in 1909, lived in San Juan Hill, as did the renowned Puerto Rican historian and archivist Arturo Schomburg, for whom the Schomburg Center of the New York Public Library is named. So it was a neighborhood that was not, I mean, calling it a slum and treating it as simply a kind of neighborhood full of problems was, of course, a major distortion. Writer and urban reformer Mary White Ovington, she was a white woman, explained the origins of the name of the neighborhood, San Juan Hill, in a book she published in 1911. That was her exploration of the status of African Americans in New York City during her time in the early 20th century. The book was titled Half a Man. It's quite an interesting text. I mean, she was a kind of sympathetic reformer, and she herself actually was one of the founders of the NAACP, in collaboration with W.B. Du Bois and a number of others. So Ovington wrote in this book, Half a Man, that the name San Juan Hill was coined by, quote, an onlooker who saw the policemen charging up during one of the once common race fights in the neighborhood. So charging up was a reference to the Battle of San Juan Hill, made famous by Teddy Roosevelt, who was president at the time of this anecdote. and had led a volunteer regiment in this successful battle during the Spanish-Cuban-American War in 1898. So the first reference to San Juan Hill as a neighborhood in New York that I could find was in the New York Times in this July 1905 article with this headline, "Black and White War in a Crowded District." At first here in this article, the name appeared in quotes. By 1906, as similar articles were published in the New York Times, the name appeared without quotes. Ovington described the tenement dwellings in the neighborhood as, and this is also still in her 1911 book, she described the tenement dwellings as human hives, honeycombed with little rooms thick with human beings, she wrote. She described a lot of vice, but also, as she said, many respectable families. Now, this was the era of progressive reform, and progressive reformers were focused a lot on housing. So improvement first came to the neighborhood in 1909 via what were called model tenements that progressive reformers thought would improve the city's slums. So this first model tenement was built in San Juan Hill. It was called the Tuskegee, and it was at 213 and 215 West 62nd Street. That was between Amsterdam and West End Avenue, constructed by the City and Suburban Homes Company. And then the model tenement Ovington most admired was built just a block away a couple years later by Henry Phipps. Phipps was a rich industrialist, a contemporary of Andrew Carnegie, John Rockefeller, J.P. Morgan. They were all born in the 1830s, although Phipps showed a bit more real concern for the welfare and housing of working people than these contemporaries. Ovington really admired Henry Phipps's first tenement housing project, which was in the 31st Street between 1st and 2nd. I guess that's Murray Hill, maybe. I don't know what it was called then. It was mostly for white tenants. And then he decided to build this second development not long after the first was completed. This development was from the 233 to 247 West 63rd. That was also the block between Amsterdam and West End Avenue. Mary White Ovington described the Phipps houses. This was referred to as the Phipps houses or Phipps Apartments number 2. It was his second project. She said that the landlords rented only to respectable families, and they changed the character of the block. Mary White Ovington herself lived for 8 months in the Phipps houses on this block. She said she was the only white tenement at the time. It was about 160 units. And here, okay, now I'm transitioning a little forward in time. So by the time of World War I, not long after Ovington's book was published and she chronicled the origins of the San Juan Hill neighborhood, the Great Migration of Black Southerners to northern cities had changed New York City substantially. And soon landlords in Harlem began to rent to Black tenants because housing quality in Harlem was a bit better than it was in San Juan Hill at this time. Some newer and more middle-class housing had been built over the previous couple of decades. Many of the African Americans in San Juan Hill who could afford to move uptown left the neighborhood. Toward the end of World War I, Puerto Ricans simultaneously began their kind of early migration in larger numbers to New York City, a few thousand a year. The US Congress had just made Puerto Ricans into US citizens in 1917. So migration suddenly became easier for Puerto Rican migrants, and there was some industrial pull after World War I. So a few thousand Puerto Ricans a year began settling in East Harlem and around the Brooklyn Navy Yard. Not too many in San Juan Hill until the 1930s, although there are records of jazz musicians and clubs that included some important Puerto Rican and also Cuban jazz musicians in the first decades of the 20th century. And the neighborhood actually became known for its Latin music dances, especially the Copacabana at, I think, 60th Street and Central Park West, and several other similar clubs. So housing was a problem that Black and Puerto Rican and other Caribbean immigrants in New York had been talking about in since at least the 1920s. And by the 1930s, progressives and liberals in New York were focused on it too. The Depression had brought attention to the dire living conditions of poor New Yorkers. So soon, members of the New Deal politicians were advocating for fair and decent housing also. So in this photo here, this is taken in 1936. You see on the right, to the right of center, the Tuskegee model tenements. And then to the left, a boarded up tenement building. So you see the kind of the vision for the model tenements already a bit shadowed by the 1930s, by the Depression era. In 1939, under pressure from the NAACP, the New York State Assembly passed an anti-discrimination law that included housing. The idea was to produce racially integrated housing projects, and the New York State Assembly promoted this, although it continued to be an elusive goal. So by the early 1940s, when African-American civil rights leaders were pushing the federal government to act against discrimination, first in employment, A. Philip Randolph, and the first March on Washington that didn't actually happen in 1941 because President Roosevelt agreed to desegregate the military industry as a response to this civil rights pressure. In this moment, housing discrimination became more visible. New York City Council itself passed a law in 1943 that prohibited racial discrimination in any housing development that benefited from tax exemptions. The focus of the controversy actually behind this legislation was Stuyvesant Town, but that's another development story. So nevertheless, despite this legislation, both the New York State legislation and the City Council's legislation, building code provisions were not, or the segregation still existed, and also building code provisions were not enforced much. After World War II, the housing crisis was severe, and landlords, especially those in poorer neighborhoods, mixed class neighborhoods, were able to rent to tenants who didn't have a lot of power they had fewer options, and this was especially true for Black and Puerto Rican tenants. So they were unlikely to report code violations. Reports about tenements in the San Juan Hill neighborhood from the 1940s and early 50s cited, I'll sort of detail a few of the descriptions from this report on San Juan Hill in 1952. There was a lack of central heat in most units. About half of the units did not have hot water, and the majority had no private bathrooms. They shared a hall toilet. Some had bathtubs in the apartments, often in the kitchen. Half of the apartments were rated by these housing inspectors as dirty, more than half in poor repair. It's unclear exactly what that meant, but we can imagine. So many of the Puerto Rican residents of San Juan Hill in this era were recent migrants. They had fewer options, and many of them arrived in the city without jobs. And so it was not uncommon to share housing with, family or other contacts in the city. So the recorded density of Puerto Ricans residences in the San Juan Hill neighborhood in this era, the early 50s, was 2.58 people per room. And this was compared to 1 person per room in the general population of San Juan Hill. So it was considerably more dense living conditions. So the city's first response to difficult housing conditions in San Juan Hill in the post-war period was also, of course, a response to the post-war housing crisis, was the construction of the Amsterdam houses. This was built in 1948, exactly where the Tuskegee model tenement and the Phipps houses had been on these 62nd, 63rd Street. I'm not sure exactly what the boundaries were, but also between Amsterdam and West End Avenue. There were 13 Amsterdam houses, 13 buildings in the Amsterdam houses complex, about 6 stories high, most of them, I think. Among the initial tenants, about 24% of them were Black, although only about 4% of the tenants in the late 1940s, early 1950s of the Amsterdam houses, only about 4% were those who had actually been displaced from the blocks where the project was built. Those blocks were about 95% African American at the time that they were razed. RAZED. So as the Amsterdam houses were being completed, Congress was simultaneously negotiating some major updates to the New Deal federal housing legislation that had passed in the 30s. And a major new housing act was passed in 1949. One major problem for liberals was that the liberal proponents of this bill reported that they'd had to choose between enacting a segregated public housing program and enacting no program at all. So as adopted, the 1949 Housing Act stipulated that local authorities design separate public housing projects for Black and white residents, or that they segregate Blacks and whites within what were purportedly integrated projects like the Amsterdam houses. So this is, of course, the government engaging in de jure segregation. So this was all a prelude to the enthusiasm for slum clearance that we'll see now, and we'll return to the story of San Juan Hill in just a moment. Actually, I do want to say something about redlining and another kind of limitation on housing justice, especially for Black and Puerto Rican residents of San Juan Hill in this era. So one of the really important aspects of the background of the slum clearance program of the 50s was a phenomenon in mortgage risk assessment called redlining. Many of you have probably heard of this and know something about it. This practice in the real estate industry was developed in the late 1930s. It's another dimension of the New Deal legacy. It's got quite a complicated history. I'll try not to oversimplify it, but if you're curious, there's an excellent website called Mapping Inequality that was developed by a group of historians, geographers, and archivists. And you can look at a bunch of these maps that I'll describe briefly here. So redlining was the process by which the Federal Housing Administration, the FHA, and the Homeowners Loan Corporation, this is a federal mortgage insurance agency created during the New Deal, the HOLC. It was the process by which these agencies rated neighborhoods in terms of the perceived financial risk of backing mortgages in these areas. So each of several risk areas was assigned risk levels was assigned a color, and red was designated the highest risk. Hazardous, that was the term used, hazardous to lenders. So the mortgage rates in areas deemed high risk were much higher or home buyers in those areas could not even get a mortgage, or if they could, it was not a federally backed mortgage and therefore was likely to be set at predatory rates. Since once there existed federally backed mortgages after this legislation, the New Deal legislation in the 30s, there was now this kind of like bifurcated market where the federally backed mortgages were much more stable and affordable. And for the most part, people of color were excluded from, or residents in Black or Puerto Rican neighborhoods, certainly in New York City, and other people of color elsewhere in the United States were excluded from these mortgages. So it's important to point out that the idea of risk, of course, was a complex determination, and it was based on a combination of demographic data and subjective perceptions of the neighborhood's housing stock and its residents. So these were judgments by bankers and policymakers founded on racist ideas about social order. So the stigma created by these HOLC and FHA maps set the stage for cycles of neighborhood decline starting in the 1930s. Homebuyers with access to federally backed mortgages would not buy houses in redlined neighborhoods, and those who did buy houses there could only get predatory mortgages, leaving them with little money to maintain properties. So home values in these neighborhoods declined even more quickly. And so-called slum landlords dominated the rental market. So that's the background of designating San Juan Hill as a slum. Of course, it had been called a slum since the early 20th century, but once in the post-World War II era and the era of the Cold War and efforts to kind of improve neighborhoods and use housing redevelopment strategies to essentially sanitize city neighborhoods, this turned out pretty badly for San Juan Hill. So the mixed racial character of the neighborhood combined with its old decrepit housing stock translated to a D rating marked red, so that landlords paying for properties with private mortgages at higher rates improvised in order to make their investments profitable. They violated housing codes to subdivide apartments, rented smaller units. This was possible in neighborhoods where people were poor and had fewer options, especially Black and Puerto Rican New Yorkers who could not find housing in many parts of the city, so their options were limited. So the combined area, well, San Juan Hill and Lincoln Square were considered blighted by the new committee called the Mayor's Slum Clearance Committee. It was established. So I want to, of course, point out that we ought not accept at face value the city leaders and real estate developers' definition of blight in a neighborhood like San Juan Hill. Neighborhoods that were targeted by slum clearance in the 1950s and slated for urban renewal projects. Of course, people were living their lives here in San Juan Hill and in other neighborhoods, slated for slum raising. This plan to raise San Juan Hill and create a much nicer development in the neighborhood was first floated in 1955 in San Juan Hill. And because this is an important historical moment, I just want to take a moment to set the scene. 1955 was also the year when the civil rights campaigns that Black Americans had been building for decades were coming or were becoming much more visible to the nation. And with, let's see, it was 1955 was 1 year after the Brown v. Board Supreme Court decision. It was the year the 14-year-old boy Emmett Till was murdered in Mississippi, and that became a public or there was much more public attention to that lynching than there had been to the thousands of others in earlier decades. 1955 was also the year of the Montgomery bus boycott. The mid-1950s was also a transitional time for the Puerto Rican community. 1954 was the first year that New York saw a slight decline in the massive number of Puerto Rican migrants arriving in the city during the spike in migration after World War II. The peak of those years was, I think, 1953, and more than 50,000 migrants a year were arriving in New York in those early years of the 1950s. And the negative publicity about the migration was just kind of overwhelming to the Puerto Rican community writ large, not just the migrants, but to the established Puerto Rican community. Leaders spent a lot of time responding to the really brutal anti-immigrant racist diatribes published in, the tabloids, but also in the New York Times. So Puerto Rican leaders who had been in the city for decades were becoming more vocal about discrimination against Puerto Ricans, inspired in part by the African American movement, also by their own experience. Puerto Ricans in this era in the mid-50s were also very active in the labor movement by then, and were beginning to seek political recognition. There were a number of Puerto Rican residents of Manhattan and Brooklyn who ran for office in the mid-1950s. Still, a majority of Puerto Ricans in the city lived in very difficult conditions. And the reformers' worries about housing were connected, especially in relation to the kind of what many observers referred to as the Puerto Rican problem of the 1950s. Worries about housing were connected to concerns about crime, juvenile delinquency, and disease, infant mortality, etc. So these were all problems that were blamed on Puerto Ricans themselves in this era. And some of them were about perception. Some of them were connected to the actual living conditions of the migrant community. And I just want to add, just for larger context, remember that European immigration had been effectively shut down in the mid-1920s. And in New York City, Puerto Ricans were really the only population of foreigners, so-called foreigners, that entered the city in large numbers between the mid-1920s and the 1950s. And so they were treated as scapegoats. And of course, that was also a racialized treatment of these migrants. So at the start of the campaign to persuade New Yorkers that it was a good idea to raze San Juan Hill to make way for the Lincoln Center plan, urban planner and city commissioner Robert Moses issued a press release that claimed, quote, "Aggressive slum clearance programs can rid the city of its 400,000 substandard dwelling units in the next 15 to 20 years. Moses promised what he called a, quote, renewed and vigorous program of new public housing in its place. That that was something, the public housing part of the slum clearance and urban renewal was something that Moses generally did not spend any time following through on. The great historian Robert Caro, in his book The Power Broker, about Robert Moses, describes many examples of the failure to address the housing needs of people displaced by these renewal projects in the 1950s and 60s in particular. So in some ways, the story in San Juan Hill is not, it's not unique. It was a particularly egregious example of not caring, not paying really attention at all to what the displaced tenants would need. So these aggressive slum clearance programs were founded on Robert Moses's and other city officials' false promises, for sure. So here I want to show you, this is a couple of images showing the transition as slum clearance was presented as a remedy for the problems of poor neighborhoods. But in every instance, this approach to redevelopment really only created more pressure for low-income housing, not less. Only a tiny percentage of displaced tenants wound up in one of the new public housing projects that were being constructed starting in the late 40s. Most tenants in San Juan Hill landed in some other substandard housing, usually worse than the place they were pushed out of. So there was a harsh irony for the first wave of residents being pushed out of San Juan Hill in 1957, which is that was also the year the New York City Council passed the first law in the nation prohibiting discrimination in privately owned housing. So those displaced from San Juan Hill should have been protected by both city and state law from any discrimination in housing, public or private. Of course, that was not the way things played out. And for Puerto Ricans, the story of displacement in Lincoln Square ended with an additional pretty terrible irony. Also in 1957, the same week that a group of tenants appeared in court, represented by housing activist Harris Present, they appeared in court to resist their evictions, the same week that the play West Side Story opened on Broadway, which featured a young Puerto Rican woman from an unidentified West Side neighborhood. A few years later, when the very popular play was being turned into a film, the rubble of San Juan Hill and Lincoln Square was the perfect setting for the representation of a dilapidated slum. So the second image below left is one from the archives of the production of West Side Story. Okay, so that's the story of the first major episode of housing displacement and broken promises experienced by Puerto Ricans in New York City. And now I'm going to transition to recounting a long coda to this story. And I'm trying to, my clock is a little bit off. I think I have about 20 minutes left, but I suppose Sean can stop me if I go over time. So not long after thousands of Puerto Rican residents were displaced from San Juan Hill, the conclusion of the real West Side Story, there were two other stories of displacement and broken promises developing in other Puerto Rican communities in New York, in the South Bronx and in Loisaida, or the Lower East Side. So the housing situation in these two Puerto Rican neighborhoods in the 1960s and 70s was significantly worse than it had been in the so-called slum of San Juan Hill in the 1950s. In large part, this decline was due to deindustrialization, the departure of good manufacturing jobs from the city, which meant that the hope of basic economic security was disappearing. And for jobs that required less than a high school education, the number was falling rapidly, and this hit Puerto Rican communities and other migrant communities, but Puerto Rican, the kind of the primary migrant population in New York City, the new population. So this deindustrialization hit Puerto Ricans harder than any other New Yorkers. And then by the early 1970s, New York was sliding into fiscal crisis, which meant cutting city services. And this phenomenon also hit poor communities first and hardest. So by this point, by the early 1970s, nowhere was the devastation of as visible as it was in the South Bronx, where a large proportion, the plurality of residents in the South Bronx. Now that's a hard area to define, but at the time that it was the definition of the South Bronx in the 1970s, that area was plurality Puerto Rican. just a few figures to illustrate some of this, the context. Of 2,000 manufacturers in the South Bronx in 1959, only 650, or like less than a third, remained by 1974. So this was an estimated loss of about 18,000 jobs in a community that was already poor. This is an image of the neighborhood crumbling, literally. Although, as I sort of reminded us in looking at the images of San Juan Hill, most people who live in a community, no matter how crumbling it is, are trying to make just live their lives, take care of their families, and deal with life's challenges, separate from the dramatic conditions. The situation in the South Bronx was not helped by the media. In 1973, this headline in the New York Times, "A jungle stalked by fear and seized by rage," was this kind of sensational headline. And that was nothing unusual in terms of how the South Bronx was represented. And the reality in the neighborhood, of course, was also harsh. Many residents fled the neighborhood if they could. One report by the Department of City Planning estimated that the South Bronx lost 100,000 residents in 7 years in the 1970s. Another estimate showed that the 21st district, the congressional district, the South Bronx, lost a full half of its registered voter population between 1974 and 1976. So in the midst of these conditions, there was, people were active and protesting. There were artists and musicians. I mean, this was the South Bronx was where hip hop was born. And there were also increasingly visible leaders among the Puerto Rican community. The Puerto Rican-born Herman Badillo, who was elected Bronx Borough president actually in the 1960s, and then became the first Puerto Rican elected to Congress in 1970. But still, despite this vitality, the dramatic images of deterioration were getting national attention. This was both good and bad. So just a couple words on the problem of arson in the South Bronx that gave it kind of its worst notoriety in the 1970s. Arson and other uncontrolled fires exploded in the mid-1970s. There were over 30,000 incidents of arson in the South Bronx in 1974 alone. This is just a kind of remarkable statistic. This was also, of course, during the city's fiscal crisis, when many fire stations were closing or closed due to budget cuts. So this the Bronx became kind of synonymous with fires and arson, especially after the second game of the 1977 Baseball World Series, when a major fire broke out in a vacant school building just a few blocks from Yankee Stadium. As the game got underway, Howard Cosell, the sportscaster, was said to have announced, "There it is, ladies and gentlemen, the Bronx is burning." It turned out that wasn't exactly what he said, but it was a catchy quote and it stuck. A few years later, just to sort of situate what was actually causing all of these fires, 2 Bronx landlords who were also insurance brokers were indicted and eventually convicted of crimes that amounted to arson for profit. There were 50 fires in 17 buildings that they owned, 50 fires between the years 1976 and 1979. This was just the tip of the iceberg because crimes like this were very hard to prosecute. So over the course of the decade, more than 50% of the neighborhood's housing units were lost to arson. So this is pretty dire situation. So in the late 70s, to address this crisis, President Jimmy Carter made a high-profile trip to the South Bronx. he was first attending meetings on international human rights policy at the United Nations in Midtown Manhattan. He was known as a champion of human rights and moral policies, both at home and abroad. And then he traveled by limousine to Charlotte Street in the South Bronx. And of course, it was a bitter irony that Carter drove just a few miles from the UN to observe thousands of people suffering from lack of many of the protections his administration were championing elsewhere in the world. So Carter talked about hopes that tenant groups could improve things. The problem, there were lots of community organizations and tenant groups in the South Bronx, and especially among in the Puerto Rican community. The problem was that they had little support and funding. So it was easy for Carter's critics to point to the situation in the neighborhood as one of his many failures as president. He had made this big show of doing something for the South Bronx, and not much happened, especially in the several years following his visit. So during the 1980 presidential primary, when Carter was running for re-election, his Democratic challenger, Senator Edward Kennedy, also came to the South Bronx, made a strategic visit to the same beleaguered area that Carter had toured several years earlier. And Kennedy took an easy shot at his opponent. He said, President Carter stood on this spot in October 1977. He saw the devastation and he pledged to repair it. That was, hard for Carter to respond to. Community groups, South Bronx residents and activists from around the country converged right about this time on Charlotte Street for what they called a People's Convention that took place just before that year's Democratic National Convention at Madison Square Garden. And this was the point, actually, when the artist John Fechner painted the mural decrying falsas promesas, or broken promises. We see that mural in the background with Ronald Reagan making the most of this backdrop. His comment, one of his many comments to the media that day was, I haven't seen anything that looks like this since London after the Blitz. Ronald Reagan's political strategy was to read the mural's message as an indictment of Carter alone. But of course, the real story behind the mural and its message was far more complex. The promises broken had been made over the course of decades. They had been made by Robert Moses. They had been made by other city planners. And these were promises that slum clearance would solve the problem of substandard dwellings, promises by multiple mayors who created committees on Puerto Rican affairs starting in the 1940s, but didn't listen to its community leaders, promises by many federal officials who said the South Bronx was a shameful aberration in American prosperity, but failed to commit funds to rehabilitate it, to support the lively tenant groups and community organizations that were ready to try to solve their housing problems. Sometime after the 1980 campaign, a New York Times journalist referred to Charlotte Street in the South Bronx, that area that had gotten so much attention, as, quote, the nation's most abused political prop. So I want to turn our attention now away from analyzing politicians' performances and look more closely at what people who were actually struggling to address decent housing, what were they doing in their communities? They were protesting, organizing squatting actions, pressuring the city to formalize a homesteading program. So two organizations I'll mention right here started in the Upper West Side. I won't be able to do justice to the origin story of housing activism in various New York City neighborhoods in the 1970s. It was a really pretty kind of remarkable focus of community activism in an era where there was lots of community activism. But I just want to tell you briefly, Puerto Ricans were at the center of this movement, first in the Upper West Side, these two organizations, El Comité, an organization of young Puerto Ricans that led the squatter and homesteading movement that was emerging there. A quick definition also, squatters lived in spaces without any legal rights, while homesteaders worked with city officials to gain legal right to property through their investment of time and labor. So there was like sometimes people were engaged in squatter actions and then worked to transition into something legal, sometimes not. The second organization is called Operation Move In. This was a multiracial organization, also started in the Upper West Side with significant Puerto Rican participation. So these were ideas and practices that spread through organizations like this. I mean, these were the sort of two largest and best known in the Puerto Rican community on the West Side. And they spread to other communities, including the South Bronx and the Lower East Side. So now I'm going to say just a few things about the Lower East Side. So one of the drivers of regeneration in Lower East Side, this is the kind of nickname that Puerto Rican residents of the Lower East Side gave to the community in the 1970s. One of the drivers of kind of community energy was the Real Great Society, a group led by a former gang leader turned community activist named Chino Garcia. And the Real Great Society launched, first it got visibility for launching a very beloved and much lauded community education program called the University of the Streets. Garcia and several like-minded activists then began focusing, I mean, they enjoyed the education aspect of the organization, but they began focusing a lot on the housing problems of their community, on the general issue of fair and affordable housing, not just in their community, but beyond. And they founded a separate kind of, a separate organization related to their housing concerns. The organization was called Charas. I'll show you a slide in just a second with the name. It's an acronym of the founders' names. So this group got interested in the work of architect and visionary Buckminster Fuller, who in turn was fascinated by Charas and the work they were doing in Lower East Side. So the group began collaborating with Fuller and actually working closely with one of his proteges and fabricating a series of geodesic domes in the Lower East Side. So according to a review of this book that was published, I think in the late 70s by photographer Sias Motel, Charas saw the geodesic dome as a, quote, model to challenge the community's lack of agency in the conditions of their lives in the city. And it's true. I mean, this is a fascinating book, a fascinating account of a several years long collaboration and experiment in both community building and housing. And Charas members embraced Buckminster Fuller's idea that, as Buckminster Fuller said, people should strive to, quote, do more and more with less and less until eventually you can do everything with nothing. So in both the South Bronx and in Lower East Side, organizations and community members managed to do pretty amazing things with almost nothing in terms of formal resources. They engaged and got particularly were remarkably successful in creating this regeneration in their communities through community gardens. This became actually a central focus of community activists, many people who had been connected to housing justice by the late 1970s. I just put on this slide some bibliographic items about community gardens that were listed in a pamphlet produced by the Bronx Museum in 1980, which I found really notable because already by the late 70s, journalists and horticulturalists were taking note of this phenomenon in the regeneration of neglected city neighborhoods. And it was coming out of these two Puerto Rican neighborhoods, the South Bronx and Loisaida. And last, I want to show you a map by this organization, the Loisaida United Neighborhood Gardens. It's just a kind of a cool image showing this wealth of green space in the Lower East Side, this amazing legacy of the pioneers and homesteaders and squatters and the creative members of the community who had been plagued by displacement, by broken promises of housing, fair housing. And this really started with the thousands of Puerto Rican residents and Puerto Rican and other residents pushed out of San Juan Hill in the late 1950s. I don't want to conclude here that that fierce community activists can hold a community together alone. Obviously, part of the promise of urban redevelopment and its more recent iterations is to make more resources available to more people, and elected officials and city government have to fund that. But people who held the spirit of community above the value of profit, those who advocated continually for their right to quality housing, to parks, city services, and recognition as equal partners in planning their communities. These historical actors have made good on their promises to share with everyone the spaces they create. And these community gardens, I think, are a good place to end. I am happy to take questions now.
Thank you so very much, Lauren. That was great. It's amazing to see that 1938 map and just crazy to imagine how much of it was marked in red as a no-go zone, especially with rates of cost of housing as it is today. I had a couple questions in the chat already that were sent to me privately. So if you don't mind, I'll bombard you with those. We also, if anybody else wants to say anything, please feel free to raise your virtual hand or put it directly in the chat. So the first one was, where did you find the report on landlords ignoring the maintenance in San Juan Hill? Was that through studies by people like Mary White Ovington, or was that?
No, that was like a 1952 report of the community. I'll check my files. You know, honestly, that is one of those amazing things that turns up now that's like a fully digitized, you know, it was a local community organization. And one of their objectives actually was to get a sense of the school age population of the neighborhood. So there's a map in that report. It's maybe like a 40-page report. I mean, it was like a city, it was maybe a collaboration between a city social welfare agency and like a kind of community welfare agency. I can't, I mean, I could go digging in my files right now, but I'm not going to do that. I can't remember the name. I do know it was 1952. And it was based on some survey data that was not clearly specified about the condition of the housing, the rental housing in like from, you know, I think it was a bit south of this, like the 19 to 57th Street, maybe up to 64th or something.
Thank you. I do see Gale Brewer in the audience, so if she does want to pipe in, she's welcome to do that.
Keep going, Sean. I'm so sorry. I was at another event, but keep talking. This is fascinating. I love listening.
Thank you. Talking. Mark has asked, what did Robert Moses promise to the San Juan Hill residents in his redevelopment plans?
Well, he made that kind of general claim that everybody would basically, you know, there was plenty of public housing available, which was not true. And then also that, I mean, he didn't specify this in that particular 1955 press release, but what Robert Caro details excruciatingly in The Power Broker is some examples in other neighborhoods where, you know, the residents were told that they could call an office that would help them relocate. They were supposed to be compensated a little bit for their like moving costs, and they were supposed to get help finding apartments that were of comparable cost, and that was almost never possible. I mean, that was the thing about displacing people at a time when the vacancy rate was 1%, like it was just, it was impossible. So he didn't, I'm not sure if I can find the note exactly what he said, and he said that let's see. Yeah, it was not a specific set of promises, just that there would be people to help the residents to find new apartments, and that there were housing developments that were being built, and that was just kind of vague and didn't pan out for almost anybody.
Everybody always cites West Side Story as the movie about that features San Juan Hill, but Ed Norton had a 2019 film, Motherless Brooklyn. And there's a moment at the start of it where they're emptying out this office at the end of the day where people are doing their applications because they're clearing for Lincoln Center. And then the worker just takes everything and drops it in an ash can and shuts the lid as they close
Yeah,
it and go home.
I remember that. First of all, I love that movie because there's no like Robert Moses character in the book Motherless Brooklyn. I love Jonathan Letham's work. And I loved how that movie was kind of turned into a kind of like the story of redevelopment and Robert Moses, and that is a terrible detail. Actually, and one thing that I didn't mention in the talk is that in the late 40s, the Puerto Rican government, the Puerto Rican Department of Labor it has established something called the Migration Division, which was like a kind of labor organization to help situate Puerto Rican migrants in, stable jobs in various places in the United States. It wasn't just New York City. It was also, they had a farm labor in New York. The office had kind of originated as a place where people could go and get assistance with jobs, and also sometimes find apartments, and just other access to other services for needy new arrivals, but also for more established Puerto Rican residents. And the Migration Division office had opened on, I think it was either 60th or 62nd, like somewhere right where Lincoln Center is now, was that office was opened just like in the late 40s. And it opened right there because that's where the largest of new Puerto Rican arrivals was landing.
It was the Kennedy building. It was the largest building torn down for Lincoln Center. And the Kennedys had this investment. They got over market for it. It's on our site. It was catty-corner from the Empire Hotel, and they actually had a U.S. bond office in the base of it. So after you got your citizenship and you were all jazzed, you would go buy your war bonds and invest in this new country and this dream.
Wow. Wow.
So I just have a few more questions here. Was Section 8 a direct response of the lack of housing? Coupled with that, there was a question about the Lincoln Towers. Were they supposed to be for San Juan Hill's displaced residents? That was never the case. That was always to stabilize the white middle class and keep them from fleeing to Long Island and the suburbs. And also, was there any amount of rent stabilization or rent control in these areas that you're aware of?
That I don't know. And I don't, I'm not, I'm not sure. I can't answer the question about Section 8 either. I don't want to claim to, this. Yeah, I'm not sure.
Good answer. Two other comments. One is politicians are making outrageous claims today in regards to the city of Yes. I know you're in New Jersey. You may not be as familiar with it. There's a three-pronged vision from the current mayor, city of Yes, for carbon neutrality, which passed, City of Yes for economic opportunity, which is being voted on by council tomorrow, and City of Yes for housing opportunity, which requests every neighborhood to take a little more development. But the question is, does it look like history is repeating itself? Do you get the sense that different governments are still pushing different forms of displacement?
I mean, I think a somewhat cynical but also realistic answer generally is like, I mean, sure, like housing in a city like New York, I mean, there is no other city like New York, but in big cities, and this is true in many other places in the US, it's always a problem. I mean, and the government is always wanting to help people, or just sort of like assuage people's fears, but is limited in how it can act. I mean, so not exactly history repeating itself. Like the conditions are so different, but housing remains just like I said, starting out, just it's such a fundamental issue. And when there are limited resources, as there always are, and competing projects and competing goals of how to spend money, people's needs to have stable housing wind up not making it to the top of the list.
For those with New York Times subscriptions, there's a piece online, it went up live today at least, about Palm Springs and a displaced community that they literally burned through, but it's also happens to be on native land. So that complicates it, that the government has finally taken, I think it's called Section 18 or Section 14, and it's a zone where they basically wanted to redevelop. So they just burned everybody's houses down or displaced them overnight with no access to their materials. Gil asks, I've read that the displacement of Puerto Ricans from San Juan Hill had a devastating domino effect on the Puerto Rican neighborhood, later known as Manhattan Valley. Excuse me. Can you comment on this?
As a non-New Yorker, someone should tell me, where is Manhattan Valley?
I was just schooled on the difference between the Bloomingdale region and Manhattan Valley today, but it's essentially portions of it, I think, were the old neighborhood, which is where Park West Village is, just north of 97th Street on Central Park West.
I don't know. I mean, I do like the two organizations that I described, Operation Move In and El Comité, were both, I mean, that's like a little north of where those organizations were founded in the late 60s, early 70s.
Yeah, El Comité was West 88th Street in Columbus. Yeah.
Right. So, I mean, I'm just sort of speaking generally that there was, that area is not generally known as a very Puerto Rican neighborhood, but it really was a significant population of Puerto Ricans in the years after the displacement from San Juan Hill. And nobody has done, I mean, I suppose a person could spend, many years trying to trace some actual people and where they landed. I've been speaking kind of in general terms, so I don't know. But that part of the Upper West Side, in terms of Puerto Rican residents, certainly expanded and became politically more important in the 1960s and 70s. And I surmise that that the displacement from San Juan Hill had a significant impact on it. I can't prove it. I haven't sort of traced in detail how that might have worked, but it's a fair assumption. It's something I hope, I'm not sure I'll be the person to do it, but I hope somebody writes a more like a whole book on this, these interconnected stories.
Just so you know, every year there is a reunion of the descendants of the people who were part of El Comité. So if anybody wants to come to that reunion in July, let me know.
Cool. Where does the reunion take place?
In the 92nd Street between Amsterdam, Columbus and Central Park West, in the park and on the street. No, 46th Street. Yeah, yeah, I'm on the phone. Go ahead. I'm in a cab, sorry. Oh.
Thank you for that. So you've opened up a lot of topics, and these are things that it's important for us to be understanding and discussing. So we appreciate that very much, Dr. Thomas, and we thank you for your time and research on this. So far, the little bits we found, the people who were displaced and did get housing went to the Vladeck houses on the Lower East Side, but it's a minority of the people who were displaced. And we've got a few oral histories on our website I'd like to just draw everyone's attention to. And there was one person, Miguel Ramirez, he had talked about he lived with his 4 siblings in a studio with his mother, and he's never been back to the neighborhood. And he's an adult now.
He lived in the studio in San
It's
Juan.
on the block where Fordham currently is, Fordham's campus.
Wow.
So again, I thank you for this great presentation. I thank our guests for coming. I thank Council Member Brewer for the funding for this. I do want to draw everyone's attention to 2 other upcoming programs. We have coming up, one is on the City of Yes for housing opportunity, and that will be next week. And that is free for all. It's co-hosted with Friends of the Upper East Side Historic Districts. And then following that in June, we have one with Sarah Cedar Miller, talking about what was formerly at 170 Central Park West, current home of the New York Historical Society. I hope you'll join us all for those. After some light editing, this will be posted and shared tomorrow, and it'll be evergreen on the front side of our website. Thank you all for coming tonight, and thank you again, Dr. Thomas.
Thanks, Sean.
Wow, thank you.